Thank you, Vítor, and thank you for having invited me to this enlightening, I think I couldn't find a better word for the light, the amazing light outside, enlightening country and also enlightening meeting. It is perhaps because we are getting so much closer to the US that yesterday several presentations show something comparing unemployment on the two sides of the Atlantic. Clearly, 6 years ago, unemployment rates in the US and the Eurozone were more or less the same. Now, unemployment in Europe is almost twice as large as in the US. The gap also with another country with the same set of institutions, with a common unemployment benefit system, a social assistance system like Japan. So the gap between Europe and Japan has increased from about 5 percentage points to 8 percentage points. So no doubt, by international comparison, unemployment in Europe currently looks as unbearably high. A point that has not been made sufficiently yesterday, except for the introductory remarks by Mario Draghi and the comment from the floor. I think it was André Sapir to stress that. It is also unbearably divergent. This diagram plots the average unemployment rate in the top 4 countries in Europe in terms of unemployment rate and the bottom 4. There is no historical precedent for such a divergence in the level of the unemployment rate. The difference is about 15 percentage points. If you compare it to the US and you take the 10 states with the highest unemployment rate and the 10 with the lowest, the difference is about 5 percentage points. Also within countries in Europe, you don't get, the difference is of a factor of 2, not certainly of a factor of 4. This divergence in unemployment rate is a reason of concern by itself, because it clearly undermines cohesion in the Union, and clear is a serious problem for countries sharing the same currency. So in the paper, we first of all address an issue that we believe is very important. And this is, why is unemployment diverging in the euro area? And as I don't like to keep the suspense, let me immediately provide the answer we give to this. The answer is that it is not only institutions, as those that had been pointed out yesterday in the debate, responsible for this divergence. And it is not only shocks by themselves to explain this, but it is the interactions between shocks and institutions that has led to this divergence. And it is important also to look at the nature of the shocks themselves. The second issue that we address concerns the policy response that was done at the European level to this phenomenon, to this divergence of unemployment rate. The question is, did policy coordination and conditionality at the EU level help to deal with unemployment divergence? Well, the answer we provide is no, did not help. It was, to a large extent, a European failure. The third issue that we address is what can be done at the EU level then to reduce unemployment divergence and bring unemployment down, because by reducing divergence, we would reduce overall unemployment rate. And the key message we provide is that we should do something, because there is something which is get lost in translation in the way in which these policies are, and in the involvement of European institutions in these policies containing unemployment. So we should go directly to the citizens rather than going with the mediation of the governments. And clearly what we mean by that will be more clear later on. While looking at divergence and the sources of divergence, I think there is something that we should really look at more carefully and was not perhaps emphasized yesterday in the discussion. This recession was different in Europe than previous recessions, because typically during a recession you get a decline or a stabilization of labor force participation rates. The shaded area here depicts global recessions. There is the two oil shocks, there is the interest rate hike, then there are some recessions that were more in the US, like the dot-com recession, and then there is the Great Recession and the Eurozone crisis. So at these times, typically you get a decline in labor force participation. This time was different. Even the country experiencing the worst shock experienced an increase in participation, especially of older workers, 55 and plus. That's really a key difference with respect to previous recession, and clearly can be partly explained by wages and added worker effect, as yesterday I think was Carney to make this point. But given that it was concentrated on the group, the age group 55 and more, I think it is more related to retirement plans, to changes that had been made to retirement plans, increasing the retirement age. That's a key difference with respect to previous recession. The fact that participation had been behaving differently than in previous recessions suggests that the institutions are important, because participation is very much related to institutions such as retirement, as I was saying, part-time, family reconciliation. Also, we do in the paper a simple decomposition of the differences in youth unemployment rate, because the key factor behind the divergence in unemployment is youth unemployment. We look specifically at youth unemployment divergence, and we decompose it between the variation which is within and between countries, and we do find out that it is mostly between. Actually, the divergence within countries during this long crisis narrowed down. So really the factor behind this divergence in unemployment rates is between countries differences in unemployment. So this also seemed to point to a very important role of institutions, because institutions vary across countries mainly. So national borders denote changes in the set of labor market and social policy institution in particular. But also, when you look at the size of the output shocks and the response of the unemployment, then you see that almost 50% of the differences in unemployment variation during the crisis can be accounted for by the size of the output fall. This is clearly done by looking at Okun's law and elasticities. So we are plotting here on the vertical axis the variation in unemployment rates, and on the horizontal axis the accumulated GDP decline. As you can see, there are countries like Greece that experience a very large increase in unemployment, but once you take into account of the size of the output fall, Greece doesn't look at all as an outlier. Basically, it's very close to the regression, depicting the Okun's elasticity, the beta coefficient, the so-called beta coefficient is not so much an outlier. There are two countries here that are clearly an outlier, and one is Spain, where the increase in unemployment is much larger than could have been, in a way, motivated by the decline in output. And on the other side, we have Germany. These two countries together do explain almost half of this deviation from the Okun's law. So we do decide to focus particularly on these two countries because there are lessons we can learn from the experience of Germany and Spain. We can learn from them. There are the set of institutions in the two countries are way different. And indeed, the reaction to the shocks during the recession was markedly different in Germany and in Spain. In Germany, there were all margins of adjustment were used during the recession. There was a lot of adjustment along the hours margin because you had short-time work schemes, you had work time accounts, a new instrument that has not been used in many other countries. You also had mini jobs that allow for multiple jobs, and that's another way to operate along the intensive margin of hours. Also, the wage margin was used because a lot of progress had been made before in decentralizing wage bargaining and allowing for employment pacts to be signed at the firm level to preserve jobs. Finally, non-participation margin was also used in Germany, allowing for some decline in labor force participation. In Spain, nothing like that happened. We had only one type of margin that was used, and this was temporary employment. Temporary employment, temporary employment. This diagram shows that. You have that employment declines were concentrated, were only the red lines, which means workers on contractos temporales. And you had, in the construction sector, you had also, at the beginning of the Great Recession, this remarkable situation where workers with permanent contracts could get wage increases just while employment among temporary workers was declining by 1/3. No doubt, the shocks were different in Spain and in Germany. I'm not denying that. But certainly, even accounting for the differences in the nature and the persistence of the shocks, there is a remarkable different reactions of the labor market in the two countries that is no doubt explained by this interaction between the shocks and the institutions. Both Juan Francisco and myself are labor economists, and we're a bit skeptical about macro estimates, macro regressions of employment, unemployment. So when we started this project, we thought we should really provide micro evidence. And we were hoping very much to draw on a very important survey, and I think that the ECB should be praised for supporting this survey, which is called Wage Dynamics Network Survey. This is a survey done in all countries of Euro system, and basically looks at the reaction of firms to shocks, and also to institutions, the way they do, firms, employers, react to different institutional setups. Unfortunately, at the time of finishing this paper, only rather aggregate information was available. So I will have to confine to some very simple correlation, but I think they're still quite revealing. The first thing is we are looking here at employment declines, disemployment in firms, and looking at this in relation with the nature of shocks. As you can see, the largest employment reduction have been happening in the firms that were experiencing a fall in the demand for their product. So it would seem that the product demand has been the driving force behind disemployment in the Eurozone. Well, clearly this was a financial crisis to a large extent. So clearly we also have been looking at finance. And this diagram suggests that the attention that is being increasingly given at the border between finance and labor by research is well placed. There's no doubt finance is also important. But when we look at finance and reaction of firms, perhaps the closest correlation we get is between wage adjustment, more than quantity or employment adjustment, and financial condition. You see that the firms experiencing serious problem of refinancing have been mainly cutting wages. It's like if they were borrowing from their workers. So to summarize,
you are halfway through.
I know.
Yeah, just for your.
I know. Thanks.
Management.
I'm there. So to summarize on these facts on divergence, I would say that first, different labor market institutions imply different labor response to output shocks. And there are all of these interactions that should be duly investigated. There are many possible interactions, so clearly, as there are many institutions, but we should really focus a lot on that. This draws a bit on an initial intuition by Blanchard and Wolfers a few years ago. It is good to have institutions allowing for adjustment along several margins, not to have institutions that prevent adjustment on some margins, because you want to activate all of them. Third, you need more micro rather than macro wage flexibility, since the source of this employment is very much related to a fall in demand macro flexibility, wage flexibility is not particularly useful because clearly could also affect the demand constraint faced by firms. While micro flexibility may be pretty useful to address these refinancing problems of firms and avoid that they translate into employment losses. So the second issue, did policy coordination and conditionality at the EU level help to deal with this unemployment divergence? I already told you that our answer is no. And the reason why is no is that we do examine in the paper two ways in which this, in a way, policy at the European level was carried out. And one is clearly the fiscal policy coordination, the fiscal policy coordination framework. And the second one is the conditionality in the program countries. The fiscal policy coordination did not allow for a gradual consolidation to countries undergoing a major recession. And in some cases, it prevented automatic stabilizer to operate in these countries. And as far as EU conditionality is concerned, we do argue that imposing reforms that may backfire during recession was a risky job, and also that very important reforms were missed in exerting this conditionality. There was not really the type of learning that we would thought was necessary from the best practice that there are in Europe. Europe is a lab of experiments on labor market institution, and this was not duly used. Let me, first of all, show something that, in a way, our conclusion about the EU fiscal framework are based. We know that the fiscal framework is very much based on the notion of the output gap. If the output gap is larger than 4 percentage points, then you get flexibility. You can deviate from the deficit and the debt target. But the output gap is not easy to estimate. It draws from estimates of the natural rate of unemployment, which is itself something that you get from estimates of the Phillips curve. Yesterday we got a lot of that. And also a separate estimates of the natural rate of unemployment. Now, these are the estimates of the natural rate of unemployment done by the EC. Here we look at both, this is the average of the vintages. There are various vintages of estimates. You see the tremendous variation. In over about 6 years, the estimate of the natural rate in Italy went from 5% to 15%. In Spain, from 10 to 25%. One could argue what is natural for something that changes so much over time. Can we really develop a fiscal framework around the concept that is so difficult to track and to properly measure? Bad conditionality. We do look at conditionality exerted vis-à-vis the program countries. And we argue that when it was not a bad advice, sometimes also some good advice were made, there was a bad implementation. And let me give you instead examples of bad advice. Often there were requests for a reduction in layoff cost during recession, and there is clearly a lot of evidence, a lot of literature suggesting that reducing layoff cost during a recession means having more disemployment. And there were no recommendations instead on the hiring side that could have been very important. You could have enforced on a flow basis changes in contract rule for new hires to address contractual dualism, which is present in European countries. In some of the program countries was very serious indeed. There were forced declines in the coverage of unemployment, disability pensions, and health benefits. And this is a way to make automatic stabilizer to operate. It's not a matter of generosity of a single program, it's a matter of coverage. The coverage was reduced. Less citizens could get these transfers. There were cuts to minimum wages rather than changes in bargaining structure. Remember, it's important micro wage flexibility more than macro wage flexibility. And in some countries were forced to increase the retirement age just in the midst of a recession. Nothing was done on short-time work. I didn't read any recommendation specifically related to short-time work. Let me give an example of the conditionality vis-à-vis Greece. These are the points that were imposed on the Greek government. Reduction in the duration of unemployment benefits, 1/3 to 1/4 cut to the minimum wage, reduction of the coverage of collective bargaining. So in a way, if you don't allow for industry or country level wage bargaining in a country dominated by SME, it means that you don't have collective bargaining. Cuts to public sector pay, abolition of housing benefits, increase in retirement age, lower coverage of health insurance, reduction of severance pay. And I think the list could go on. Now, I think that there is a key issue that has been overlooked, and there is more and more literature, sound empirical literature on this, showing that reforms have a differential impact over the cycle, and there is a very important interaction between institution and the business cycle. Literature suggesting that, for instance, the good design of the unemployment benefit should be one that allows for counter-cyclical policies. Basically means that unemployment benefits should be more generous, as in the US, by the way, during recessions. Also, this literature suggests that employment protection, you should be careful in reducing layoff costs during recessions, because there you have only effect on job destruction and nothing happens on the job creation side. Also, increasing retirement age during a recession may increase youth unemployment, to the extent that there is some stability between older and young workers. It tends to concentrate all the adjustment on youth unemployment. I've been fighting for years against the lump of labor fallacy. And the first part of this diagram suggests that I was right to some extent, because you see that in Italy, we had an increase in employment rates of 55 to 64, just while youth unemployment was going down up to 2007. In 2007 and 8, we had the opposite phenomenon. Employment rates of 55 to 64 keeping on going up, and youth unemployment exploding. Certainly, the fact that we increased the retirement age was not particularly helpful to bring youth unemployment down.
3 minutes.
But let me move to the last, yes, I know.
Good.
Thanks. As I said before, if it was not bad advice, it was bad implementation. And certainly there was something that was lost in translation. The government didn't want perhaps to do the things that were imposed on them, or didn't do them properly. So I think we should have a different approach to this. Rather than imposing on government, we should try to introduce complementary institutions at the EU level, and condition the access to this institution only to countries that are doing reforms. So it's a kind of positive conditionality rather than a negative conditionality, and that at the same time applies principle of risk sharing and solidarity, and that it targets individuals rather than government, contributing to individual accounts. Let me offer 3 examples of this. The first one is an equal opportunity contract. I think this is a better word than single contract that has been used, because basically it means that you need to have a new open-ended contract with tenure-related optimal severance. This is a kind of a mix between the new Italian contract and the permanent contract and the Austrian fund. Basically means that you can get the severance pay to be given to the worker who is dismissed for economic reasons, and this clearly will be partly paid by the employer and partly being paid also by the European contribution. So that would clearly benefit the employers, because there will be less cost of dismissals, lower labor costs as well. The workers would benefit because they get more stability in their contract. Is a way to fight against the dualism, and they both will gain from human capital investment on the job. A second key example is European unemployment benefits This would also be a risk-sharing tool, no doubt, and this is something that we were missing a lot during the Great Recession. There is work showing that this could be done and designed in such a way that it would involve not very large transfers and permanent transfers across countries and preserve the distributive and stabilization properties. Finally, pensions could also be allowed to operate as stabilizers insofar as we move to a defined contribution system, as some countries have already in place, like Sweden, Italy, and Poland. Which means that you can allow for earlier retirement during recession, provided that this is done with actuarial reduction of pension amounts. This is sustainable. Clearly, it means, after all, and this should be taken into account by fiscal rules, it means, after all, that we are making the implicit debt explicit. But making it explicit means also that we should ask governments to make projection of future, not only of future pension expenditure, but of future pension distribution, because sustainability of pension means not only that the average pension should not be too high and the ratio of pension expenditure of GDP should not grow too much, but also that the distribution of the future pension should not be such that we will be forced to intervene with other transfer schemes because we will leave many people in poverty. So showing the distribution. This is a preliminary result from, in Italy, we started projecting individual pensions. So we allowed individual contributor to have a projection of their future. This pension in Italy in 2050. We'll complete this exercise in September. I will be able to provide a better estimate because we just started doing this. I think all countries should be asked to do the same exercise. It's a matter of looking at sustainability of pension expenditure. If it is sustainable, then it can also have some, can be used also over the cycle, some flexibility in retirement age. To conclude, there is not a European unemployment problem. There is a problem of divergence. But there is in that context a need for a stronger initiative of supranational European institution in fighting unemployment. And the way I think we would put it is basically that if we really want to address this issue, we should put the money where the mouth is. If you are really convinced that there are some institutions that are better than others, then we should put money into this and support at the European level the countries that do introduce this institution. We should invest in this new institution. Thank you.
But I may need help. Okay, that's fantastic. Yes, everything is perfect here. Okay, only have 15 minutes. Okay, well, I planned for a couple of hours because this is a paper where, as you noticed, the presentation was fantastic. There are lots of things in this paper, and every single thing that is written in this paper is controversial and provocative and sometimes even heterodox. So it's a tough job for a discussant because before asking yourself whether you agree or not, you really would like to write down a model and see whether the model agrees with the authors, under what parameters, under what hypothesis. And if you start doing that, you just never get out of it. So I am going to try, being French, the country of Derrida and Deleuze, I'm going to try to deconstruct this paper, but given that the paper itself is heterodox, this will somehow restore, to some extent, the Troika orthodoxy, if I have time to do all this. So basically, the main focus of this paper is that there is a link between the fiscal crisis and labor market reform. What is the interaction between the two? And that's very strange, anyway. And basically, the paper is very critical on the current approach of the EU, which says, look, guys, you are bad guys, you put yourself in trouble, now we mean business, you are going to do these structural reforms. And what Tito and Juan say is, look, that's not the right approach because you're actually adding pain to those countries that are already in pain. So I'm going to make 3 points. First of all, I'm going to discuss, the relevance of using Hawkins' law for distinguishing shocks from institutions. Then I'm going to try to address the issue of whether institutions should be cyclical, and maybe I'm going to talk about, why should institutions be set at the European level. So basically, if I understand correctly what the authors do, they say, look, if unemployment responds differently to output, it means you have different institutions. And so I ascribe sources of variations that are due to that to different institutions. And then if unemployment reacts to output the same way in country A as in country B, but say country A has a bigger output fall, then it means they have the same institutions, but country A has a bigger shock. Okay? And the authors, they are not, boastful about that. They say it's a crude methodology. Well, my point here is it's hard for me to see why this should work. Well, first of all, I think the first order effect of institutions is on average unemployment, not the responsiveness of unemployment. And you filter this out by the methodology. Second, I went to school and they taught me about the production function. So there is a relationship between output and employment, which is called the production function. And so, of course, Hawkins' law is a bit different because it's a very, a-theoretical rule of thumb that captures other things like labor hoarding. But as long as the two are linked, then if you have different institutions, there's no reason why it should change your Hawkins coefficient, unless we are talking about specific institutions that do indeed affect the extent of labor hoarding about the cycle, but we can think of plenty of institutions that would not do that, and your method will not capture differences in these institutions. Okay? So I think indeed your methodology is crude. It's probably okay to capture institutions that change the labor hoarding behavior over the cycle, but it ignores plenty of other institutions that may wrongly be classified as shocks. Well, then I don't know, how to evaluate what this methodology delivers, because if a country has a more responsive, has an unemployment level which is more responsive to output, how should I interpret that? Is it good or is it bad? Well, in some sense, you could say, look, this country is more flexible and therefore it's good. Well, it's a bit of a tautology. But we sort of know that in Anglo-Saxon countries, employment was more volatile than in continental European countries. And we thought of it as the price to be paid for a more dynamic and fluid labor market. And so according to your methodology, these Anglo-Saxon countries would have a higher Hawkins coefficient. My reading of your paper is that you consider this as bad because in a recession you get even more of an employment fall given the output fall. But I'm not sure we can draw this conclusion on the basis of the comparison between Anglo-Saxon countries and continental Europe countries. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide. Okay, so then then institutions and cycles, I guess this is the main, selling point of the paper, which is you cannot think of institutions independently of the cycle. First of all, the timing of labor market reform should be adjusted depending on the cycle. And second, institutions themselves may have parameters that should vary along the cycle. You talk about unemployment benefits, and you talk even about retirement age, which you suggest, I think that it might be adjusted cyclically too. So Okay, so I guess, you might write a model where it's optimal to do these things. The question is it sensible to do it in practice? In 1974, France was hit by the first oil shock, and the then government said, look, the poor unemployed people, they are all around. Let us increase unemployment benefits. And we never got out of this trap, which it took 35 years to try to reduce unemployment benefits. So you have, first of all, if you introduce counter-cyclicality in the generosity of unemployment benefits, you run into economic hysteresis. I'm glad that hysteresis was revived yesterday. Because, of course, if you have more generous unemployment benefits, your recession is going to last longer. And then you have political hysteresis, because when you try to implement your rule, getting out of the recession and reducing the generosity, you will find that there is political resistance against doing these things. And so even though you might write down a model where this is a good idea, I'm not sure that in reality it would be a good idea. And then you also suggest that there should be cyclicality in the retirement age. So basically, it looks like you converted yourself into the lump of labor fallacy. So maybe I should find you a job at the University of Strasbourg or Bordeaux, these places that never invited me to give seminars. Maybe the lump of labor fallacy is less wrong in recessions, but that does not make it right. If you ask people to retire earlier in recessions, you are adding a negative supply shock to a negative demand shock. And in the models that I know, it does not increase employment. It probably reduces employment. It may reduce unemployment, but maybe we care more about employment than unemployment. And then there is the question of intergenerational equity. I think you suggest these things could be actuarially fair, so I don't know what that means. In that context, I suppose that if I retire earlier during a recession, I get a lower pension than those who retire later during an expansion. Now, why do I want to sign up for this? I mean, I'm going to cross fingers. I mean, it's actually fair in terms of the pension, but I'm not sure it's fair in terms of what is good for me and what I want, right? If you force me to retire at 55 with a lower pension on the grounds that it's a recession, I may be very unhappy. Okay. Then, employment protection legislation. I fully agree that if you liberalize employment protection legislation, the impact effect is that you destroy jobs. The job creation only takes place gradually over time. I'm not sure the logical point follows that it should take place in downturns. For example, you could cook an example where, okay, if I am in a recession, many jobs are going to be destroyed no matter what, and maybe the liberalization of EPL will destroy fewer jobs in recession than if it were made in expansions, because some jobs are destroyed no matter what because of the recession. So basically, we need to think more about what is the wedge in the job destruction margin, the wedge between the socially optimal and privately optimal job destruction margin, and how does it vary along the cycle? And it's not obvious to me that the answer is that this wedge is lower in recessions. This has to be proved, and it's probably model dependent. Then there is something that I studied in the past. The identification effect may make a reform politically easier in recessions. The identification effect is that if you fear that a reform is going to threaten your job, then you might oppose it. But if people already know who is going to lose their jobs, then the remaining people may form a majority to support the reform. And so if you believe that at the beginning of a recession, well, I guess it's more like the end of a recession. If at the beginning of a recession you have a lump of people who lose their jobs, then at the end of the recession, you know the economy is going to recover, then the identification effect is more operative. You know who are the losers from the reform. They are a minority, so it's more politically viable to implement it as compared to a situation where you don't know who are the losers from the reform. So basically, well, unfortunately, I don't have much time left. So I'm going to conclude with this slide. Is cyclically adjusting institutions and reforms a good idea? Well, I guess, point number one, institutions are costly to adjust, unlike central bank interest rates. So the reason why they are not cyclical may be profound. And then, you could think of, adequacy. Like you have monetary and fiscal policy that are used to stabilize the economy. I guess one of the benefits of that is that you forget about stabilization when you deal with other things, because otherwise you become crazy, So furthermore, history teaches us that the political logic leads to reforming in times of crisis, even though it is inefficient. Because when the economy is booming, politicians are very happy. They are going to be re-elected, and why should they risk to make things go wrong if everything seems to be fine? In fact, even if you are rational, Bayesian, as things are improving, you might learn that your institutions are not so bad after all, right? So you may postpone the reform. And then, even if a reform is less good in bad times, it is still good, right? So we are not going to implement the reform at the time when its net present value is positive. We are going to implement the reform we are not going to implement the reform at the time when the net present value is maximum. We are going to implement the reform as soon as the net present value is positive, because there is discounting, right? So I'm not sure that even though the point that the net present value is higher in booms than in recession is probably correct, it does not necessarily follow that you want to postpone those reforms. Okay, and unfortunately I don't have much time left, so I will not tell you why the Troika is right, despite that the authors believe the opposite.
Yeah.
Really? Okay, so I'm going to take a couple of minutes. I think the reforms proposed by the authors probably make sense from a welfare point of view. But what's relevant to the Troika is whether the reforms reduce the divergence in the natural rates of unemployment between countries. And I think there, these are two distinct things. You can have a reform that makes unemployment benefits work better, and at the same time, it would not change the natural rate of unemployment. And what's relevant for monetary policy is the second aspect. How different are the natural rates of unemployment across countries? Why? Well, because if you have a more structurally rigid economy, you have more incentives to inflate your economy through fiscal policy. You cannot do it through monetary policy because of monetary union, but you do it through fiscal policy, and then you have divergence in fiscal stance. You might even have divergence in inflation rates, and this is a headache for Mr. Draghi, because he sees all these diverging inflation rates across countries. So what the ECB and the Euro-wide institutions want is a reduction in the divergence in the natural rate of unemployment. And so I think you have to categorize the reforms between those who achieve that and those who don't. And my feeling, although again it boils down to complex analysis, is that the reform that you propose, even though they make sense, like more cyclical unemployment benefits, do not really go in that direction, as opposed to, say, an overall reduction in unemployment benefits, which is what the Troika has imposed upon Greece, which indeed we may plausibly believe reduces the equilibrium average level of unemployment. And therefore, maybe the Troika, they look more nasty than you look. They are less social democratic, but maybe they have a point. Okay, and let me stop here.